The timestamp read 14 hours, 23 minutes, and 7 seconds when the Mavic 3T banked left on its sixth pass over the tree line. The operator, a drone reconnaissance specialist with the 79th Air Assault Brigade, whose call sign was Sokil, was not looking for a command post. He was checking suspected vehicle staging along a tree-screened dirt track approximately 11 kilometers southwest of Kurakhove, in the part of southern Donetsk Oblast where Russian forces had been grinding westward through the autumn mud. He had flown this same corridor 5 times in the preceding 6 days. He knew what it looked like. That was precisely the problem. On his monitor, the thermal return from the tree line showed 3 vertical antenna structures, spaced apart, one taller than the others, positioned at irregular intervals that suggested deliberate offset rather than natural coincidence. On his previous pass, recorded 4 days earlier, there had been one. Sokil did not immediately call it in. He circled. He held the drone at altitude for another 8 minutes, burning battery, watching the structures for movement, for personnel signatures, for the faint thermal exhaust bloom that generator operation leaves on a still winter afternoon. He saw all 3. He flagged the timestamp to Brigade intelligence at 14:31, logged the coordinates to 4 decimal places, and wrote a single annotation in Ukrainian that translated roughly as "wrong number of emitters for what should be here." 41 days later, that annotation would be the first citation in a targeting package that authorized a strike on a forward command post belonging to a brigade-level element of Russia's 8th Guards Combined Arms Army. A headquarters that had been operating in that position, undetected and unharassed, for nearly 2 months. What happened in those 41 days is the story of how open-source intelligence, electromagnetic spectrum monitoring, satellite imagery, and the patient work of volunteer analysts converted one operator's anomaly observation into a confirmed geolocation. And what happened after the strike is the story of what a single command node means to an entire operational axis, and what its destruction costs the force that loses it. This is that reconstruction. To understand why Sokil's observation mattered, you need to understand what was happening on the southern Donetsk front in the weeks before he flew that 6th pass. Russian forces had been advancing along the axis running south and southwest from Donetsk city since late 2023, progressively compressing Ukrainian defensive lines around Avdiivka, which fell in February 2024. And then continuing to push toward the cluster of settlements that anchored the next defensive layer, Kostiantynivka, Kurakhove, Volhedar. By autumn 2024, Kurakhove had become the focal point of intense fighting, with Russian forces approaching from multiple axes simultaneously. The 8th Guards Combined Arms Army, headquartered in Novocherkassk in Russia's Rostov Oblast, was one of the primary formation-level commands directing operations along this axis. The 8th CAA had been a central actor in the invasion from the beginning. Its units participated in the early assaults toward Mariupol, in the grinding battles for the Luhansk and Donetsk regions through 2022 and 2023, and in the sustained offensive pressure that characterized Russian operations through 2024. By the time Sokil was flying his reconnaissance passes southwest of Kurakhove, the 8th CAA's subordinate brigades were the primary maneuver elements pushing on the town from the south and southeast. Brigade-level command posts in Russian doctrine occupy a specific and critical position in the command and control hierarchy. They are not the divisional or army-level headquarters that sit well behind the front. A brigade CP is a forward node, close enough to the action to manage the fight in near real time, distant enough to be protected from direct artillery. In Russian practice, these command posts are typically positioned between 8 and 15 kilometers from the forward edge of battle, screened by terrain features, camouflaged with netting and vegetation, and protected by organic air defense assets. They communicate downward to battalion and company commanders, and upward to higher headquarters through a layered radio architecture that, in theory, limits signature exposure through frequency discipline and transmission brevity. In theory, what Sokil had observed from the air was evidence that the theory was not being followed. 3 antenna structures where the organic footprint of a platoon-level relay node would justify only one, that suggested a higher density communications hub. The deliberate lateral spacing of the antennas, offset from each other by approximately 60 and 90 meters respectively as measured from the drone footage, was consistent with a practice used to reduce a command post's vulnerability to a single strike by distributing its antenna farm across a wider area. That was not platoon behavior. That was not even company behavior. That was the signature of something larger trying to disguise itself as something smaller. Brigade intelligence received Sokil's flagged timestamp and opened a case file. They did not immediately act on it. A single anomaly observation from a single drone pass is not a targeting package, it is a hypothesis. To become actionable, it needs corroboration from multiple independent sources. Ideally, sources that measure different things, so that the convergence of their evidence cannot be explained as a shared error. The corroboration process took 41 days. Here is what it involved. The first thread came from the Inform Napalm volunteer network. Inform Napalm is a Ukrainian open-source intelligence organization that has been operating since 2014, initially focused on identifying Russian military personnel and units from social media, but expanding over the years into electromagnetic spectrum monitoring, satellite imagery analysis, and the cross-referencing of captured documents with publicly available data. In the weeks following Sokol's observation, Inform Napalm analysts monitoring radio frequency activity in the southern Donetsk zone noted repeated burst transmissions on a frequency band historically associated with 8th CAA Brigade-level command communications. The transmissions were brief, consistent with the compression protocols Russian military radio systems use to minimize detectable emission time, but their recurrence at irregular intervals from a fixed geographic area pointed to a persistent node rather than a mobile relay. Pinning the location from frequency monitoring alone is difficult. Radio direction finding requires triangulation from multiple receiver positions, and the geometry of the front meant that some of those positions were not accessible. What the analysts could establish was a rough sector, a zone of perhaps 3 square kilometers within which the emitter was most likely located. That zone included the tree line Sokol had flagged. The sector was not proof, it was a constraint. It narrowed the search area. The next step was imagery. One detail that keeps surfacing when you work through this case is how much the intelligence picture depended on the patient accumulation of negative evidence, not just what was there, but what had changed. Sentinel-2, the European Space Agency's open-access optical imaging satellite constellation, provides repeat coverage of most of Earth's surface on a 6 to 12-day cycle depending on cloud cover and orbital geometry. For the area southwest of Kurakhove, usable imagery from the autumn and early winter of 2024 was intermittent. Cloud cover in the Donetsk region during that season is persistent and heavy, but analysts were able to reconstruct a partial change detection sequence using available passes. What they found on a Sentinel-2 pass captured approximately 3 weeks after Sokol's initial observation was a change in the vegetation shadow pattern at the edge of the tree line. A cleared area behind the trees, an area that in earlier imagery had shown the unbroken texture of undergrowth, now showed a flattened, homogeneous surface signature consistent with compacted earth or gravel. The area measured approximately 40 by 60 meters. That is the right scale for a vehicle parking footprint, not a company-level bivouac, which would be smaller and more dispersed. A coordinated, deliberate hardstand for a command vehicle cluster. Taken together, the antenna count from Sokol's drone footage, the frequency burst activity identified by Inform Napalm, and the cleared parking footprint visible in the Sentinel-2 change detection analysis, the case was building, but it was not yet closed. The analysts needed one more element, something that could tie the specific communication signature to the specific unit. This is the part that does not make sense on the surface until you understand how much Russian radio discipline had degraded by late 2024. In the early months of the invasion, Russian forces had been reasonably disciplined about encrypted communications, using the ERA digital radio system for sensitive traffic and observing protocols around transmission brevity. By late 2024, that discipline had eroded significantly. Russian units were frequently using unencrypted voice communications on commercial frequencies, often because ERA system equipment was damaged, unavailable, or not understood by the operators tasked with using it. Ukrainian signals intelligence had adapted to this reality and was collecting extensively on the resulting traffic. Within the intercept archive being reviewed by analysts working the Kurakhove case, there were several radio exchanges that contained unit designations. One of them, a brief, unencrypted voice transmission that appeared to originate from approximately the same geographic area as the Inform Napalm burst detections, included a reference to a formation designation consistent with a brigade-level element of the 8th Guards Combined Arms Army. The transmission was not a command instruction. It was a logistics coordination exchange, a request for resupply, the most mundane possible content. But mundane content with a unit designation is analytically significant because it confirms presence and association. The geolocation closed. 41 days after Sokil flagged a timestamp at 1431, the targeting package was complete. A forward command post, brigade level, 8th Guards Combined Arms Army, operating from a screened position approximately 11 kilometers southwest of Kurakhove, confirmed by convergent evidence from drone visual observation, electromagnetic spectrum monitoring, satellite imagery change detection, and intercepted radio communications. Now here is where the process becomes interesting because a completed targeting package is not the same thing as a strike authorization. The package went up the chain to Ukrainian military intelligence and the relevant operational command. The decision about when and how to strike a confirmed enemy command post involves considerations that go beyond the intelligence picture. Timing matters. Striking too quickly risks acting before secondary nodes have been identified, potentially destroying the one visible target, while allowing the rest of the network to disperse and go dark. Waiting too long risks the target moving, because Russian command posts at this echelon do not stay in the same position indefinitely. There is also the question of available strike assets. At the distances involved, 11 kilometers southwest of Kurakhove places the target well within range of multiple Ukrainian artillery systems, including the M777 howitzer, the Polish Krab self-propelled gun, and various Soviet legacy systems. But command posts are hardened targets in a specific sense. The vehicles are not tanks. They do not have armor, but they are typically dispersed. And the communications equipment that makes a command post valuable is housed in multiple vehicles that are separated from each other, precisely to complicate targeting. To degrade a command post meaningfully rather than simply destroy one vehicle requires either munitions with submunition payloads that can cover the dispersed footprint, precision weapons directed at specific high-value elements, or a strike package with enough weight to service the entire identified footprint. Ukrainian strike planning for this target took into account the cleared parking footprint identified in the Sentinel-2 imagery, which provided the approximate positions of the vehicle cluster, and the antenna positions identified in Sokol's drone footage, which marked the communications hub. The strike package that was ultimately authorized combined multiple precision munitions and was coordinated with a suppression of the area's air defense assets to create a window for the strike elements to operate. Here is what the evidence suggests about how the strike was executed, based on subsequent battle damage assessment from drone footage and satellite imagery. The strike hit the target area in a sequence of impacts concentrated on the vehicle parking footprint and the antenna cluster. The first impacts appear to have been timed to suppress any personnel in the open and destroy the soft-skinned command vehicles before they could be moved. Subsequent impacts targeted the antenna structures directly. You do not destroy antennas with precision munitions unless your objective is to deny the communications capability, rather than simply to cause casualties. The battle damage assessment conducted in the aftermath confirmed multiple destroyed vehicles within the cleared footprint area, destruction of the antenna structures, and damage to associated support equipment. Ukrainian drone footage captured in the hours following the strike showed the characteristic black smoke of burning electronics, different from the oily orange-black smoke of burning fuel, rising from the tree line position. Informed napalm analysts monitoring the frequency bands previously associated with the command post noted that the burst transmission pattern went silent within the window of the strike and did not resume at that location. Signals that had previously been detectable from that geographic area began appearing, intermittently and with reduced density, from a different location approximately 14 kilometers to the east, consistent with a surviving element of the command structure attempting to reconstitute at an alternate position. Most people assume a brigade command post is redundant, that a modern military force has backup nodes, alternate headquarters, pre-planned reconstitution procedures that kick in automatically when the primary is hit. And to a degree, that assumption is correct. What it misses is the cost of executing that reconstitution under pressure. A brigade command post carries not just the officers and radio equipment, but the accumulated situational awareness, the map overlays, the communications registers, the fire support coordination records, the logistics tracking that represents weeks of operational continuity. When you destroy the primary node, The reconstituted alternate does not inherit that picture. It starts from a degraded baseline, and it does so at a moment when the enemy knows it is vulnerable. When subordinate units are experiencing a communications blackout and beginning to make decisions independently, and when the pressure to restore C2 integrity forces the surviving elements to transmit more, move faster, and accept more signature exposure than they would under normal operating conditions. The period following the strike on the identified command post was, according to Ukrainian General Staff reporting and corroborating open-source indicators, characterized by exactly this kind of C2 disruption. Russian forces on the axis southwest of Kurakhove showed reduced coordination during the 72-hour window following the strike. Tactical movements that would typically be synchronized across multiple battalion-level elements showed asynchronous timing. Fire support requests, identifiable from radio intercepts, showed longer response cycles and, in some cases, apparent duplication, suggesting that artillery coordination was being handled by multiple nodes that were not fully deconflicted with each other. This degradation did not halt the Russian advance. Russian forces continued to press on Kurakhove from multiple directions through the weeks following the strike, but the reduction in C2 coherence on that specific axis during that specific window had measurable effects on the tempo and effectiveness of Russian tactical operations. ISW assessments for the period noted slower than expected Russian advances in the sectors directly supported by the disrupted command node. Ukrainian defensive elements in those sectors reported, through after-action reporting, a period of reduced pressure that allowed repositioning and resupply that would have been more difficult under the previous tempo. Put yourself in the position of a Russian brigade commander who has just lost his primary command post. His forward units are engaged, his artillery is firing, his logistics chain is in motion, and his primary communications hub has just been destroyed. His staff is dead or scattered, his maps and records are burning, and the alternate position he is supposed to reconstitute to is now exposed because the enemy has already demonstrated they can find him. What he does next, how fast he reconstitutes, whether he tightens his signature discipline or accepts more exposure to restore control, will define whether this disruption is temporary or cascading. The evidence from the weeks following this strike suggests the reconstitution was partial and slow. Signals associated with 8th CAA brigade-level command activity on the southern Donetsk axis showed continued reduced density compared to the pre-strike baseline. This is not conclusive. Command posts adapt, and absence of signal is not always evidence of absence of capability. But the pattern is consistent with a formation that took a serious blow to its C2 infrastructure and was struggling to fully reconstitute it under operational pressure. We spent considerable time working through the sourcing on this case, and one detail kept nagging at us in the final reconstruction: the degree to which this entire chain depended on a decision Sokol made in that 8-minute window while burning battery over a tree line. He could have noted the antenna discrepancy and logged it as a low-priority observation. He could have attributed it to his own memory being imprecise. Maybe there had always been 2 antennas there, and he had simply not registered the second one on earlier passes. Instead, he stopped, held altitude, watched, and wrote the annotation: wrong number of emitters for what should be here. That judgment call, treating an anomaly as significant rather than as noise, is not something that can be automated. It requires a combination of mission knowledge, pattern recognition, and analytical skepticism that comes from experience and attention. Sokol had flown that corridor 5 times before. He knew what the baseline looked like. When the baseline changed, he noticed. That noticing was the foundation on which 41 days of subsequent analytical work was built. Here is a take that will probably generate some disagreement. The success of this operation reflects a systemic Ukrainian advantage in low-level ISR that Russia has persistently failed to counter effectively, and the reason Russia has failed to counter it is not primarily technical. It is doctrinal. Russian military doctrine, even in the modernized form that was supposed to emerge from the lessons of the 2008 Georgia conflict and the 2014 Donbas intervention, still treats the brigade command post as a protected asset, primarily through distance and concealment, rather than through active signature management. Antennas are placed because communications require antennas. The fact that antennas are observable from a drone operating at medium altitude is treated as an acceptable risk rather than a critical vulnerability. Ukrainian forces, by contrast, have been operating under the persistent presence of Russian drone reconnaissance for long enough, since 2014 in the Donbas, continuously since February 2022, that signature management has become a survival behavior embedded at the tactical level. The asymmetry in this case was not that Ukraine had better technology than Russia. The Mavic 3T is a commercial drone that Russia also uses. Sentinel-2 imagery is publicly available to anyone with an internet connection. Frequency monitoring requires equipment and expertise, but it is not exotic. The asymmetry was that a Ukrainian drone operator was paying enough attention. On his sixth pass over a corridor, he had already flown 5 times to notice that 3 vertical objects had appeared where one had been before, and that he treated that observation as worth flagging. What do you think? Does that level of tactical attention come from training, from motivation, from necessity, or from all 3? Leave your answer in the comments. Because the difference between an operator who notices and one who does not may be the most important force multiplier operating on this war right now, and it rarely gets the analysis it deserves. The implications of this case extend beyond the specific strike and its immediate tactical consequences. The chain of analytical work that converted Sokol's observation into a targeting package is a methodology, a systematic approach to multi-source open-source intelligence that integrates commercial satellite imagery, electromagnetic spectrum data, drone visual reconnaissance, and intercepted radio traffic into a convergent geolocation product. This methodology was not invented for this case. It has been refined over years of practice by Ukrainian military intelligence, OSINT organizations like Inform Napalm, and the broader community of open-source analysts who have been documenting the war since February 2022. What this case illustrates is how mature that methodology has become. The 41 days from Sokol's observation to completed targeting package is not a long time for the kind of multi-source analytical work involved. It is, in fact, a relatively compressed cycle for a target of this significance. The fact that it was achievable in that time frame reflects the integration of analytical tools, the availability of source data, and the coordination between military intelligence and the volunteer open-source community that has developed over years of operational experience. For Russia, the question this poses is not simply about this one command post. It is about the sustainability of a command and control architecture that relies on concealment in an environment where the adversary has demonstrated the ability to find concealed nodes through the patient analysis of publicly available data. Every Russian brigade-level command post operating on the front today exists within a signature environment that is being monitored. Antenna counts, parking footprints, frequency patterns, the analytical tools exist, the source data is accumulating, and the analysts, both professional and volunteer, are watching. Russia has been aware of this vulnerability since at least 2022, when the pattern of successful Ukrainian strikes on identified command posts first emerged as a systematic feature of the conflict. The response has been incremental and inconsistent. Some formations have improved their signature management. Others, particularly those under operational pressure that forces them to accept the trade-off between communication effectiveness and signature discipline, have not. The 8th CAA Brigade element that operated from that tree line southwest of Kurakhove for nearly 2 months was in the latter category. The pressure of the operational tempo, the need to communicate, coordinate, and control a brigade-sized force conducting active offensive operations won out over signature management, and that trade-off cost them their command post. The broader pattern this reflects in Russian military operations on the southern Donetsk axis is one of persistent tension between operational ambition and resource adequacy. The 8th CAA and its subordinate elements have been tasked with maintaining offensive pressure along a broad front, achieving territorial gains, and doing so with a force that has absorbed significant casualties in personnel and equipment over more than 2 years of continuous combat. The command structure supporting those operations has been degraded by strikes, by personnel turnover, and by the accumulated stress of operating under persistent ISR coverage. Reconstituting command nodes, finding and training replacement personnel, and maintaining communications architecture while managing signature exposure are all tasks that consume capacity that would otherwise go toward the operational mission. The strike on the command post southwest of Kurakhove was one event in a longer campaign of attrition against Russian C2 infrastructure across multiple axes, but it illustrated, with particular clarity, the mechanism through which open-source intelligence and patient analytical work can convert a tactical observation into a strategic effect. One antenna became three antennas became a targeting package. A targeting package became a strike. A strike became a disruption that, even if temporary, imposed costs on Russian operations at a moment when those costs were hardest to absorb. There is a line from a Ukrainian intelligence officer quoted in reporting from that period, not specifically about this case but about the broader pattern of command post targeting, that captures something important. They know we are looking, and they are still too visible. That is the paradox at the heart of Russian C2 vulnerability on this front. The doctrine requires communication. Communication requires emission. Emission is observable, and the Ukrainians have built a system, technical, analytical, and human, that is very good at observing. Similar patterns of intelligence integration converting anomaly observations into actionable targeting emerged in the Gulf War's planning cycles, where coalition ESR and signals intelligence created targeting packages for Iraqi command nodes with a comprehensiveness that Iraqi forces could not anticipate or counter. The parallel is imperfect. The Gulf War was a different conflict, a different adversary, a different technological moment, but the underlying dynamic is recognizable. A force that cannot hide its command structure from an adversary with the patience and tools to find it will lose command posts. And losing command posts, over time, degrades the coherence of operations in ways that compound. If you have been following this war closely, tracking the ISW daily updates, the Oryx equipment loss counts, the OSINT community's geolocation work, then this case is probably not surprising in its broad strokes. What it adds is granular detail about the mechanism, the 6 passes, the 8-minute hold at altitude, the 41 days, the convergence of 4 independent source types, the specific chain of analysis that converted an observation into a confirmed location. And that granular detail matters because it is the granular detail that makes the methodology transferable and understandable. Comment below, will Russia adapt its C2 signature management before Ukrainian analysts can work through the backlog of anomaly observations they are accumulating? Because there is almost certainly a queue of flagged timestamps, of noted discrepancies, of antenna counts that do not match baselines, and the 41-day clock is running on all of them. Could Russia have prevented this specific loss by rotating the command post before the analytical cycle closed? Probably yes. The 41-day window was long enough that a rotation protocol operating on a 30-day cycle would have forced the geolocation to restart. Whether that rotation would have been feasible under the operational tempo is a different question. Rotation requires coordination, creates its own signature, and disrupts the continuity of the command picture at a moment when that continuity is most needed. But the option existed. Does this kind of open-source targeting methodology change what NATO planners need to think about for their own command post architecture? Absolutely. And those conversations are happening. The lesson is not that concealment is impossible. It is that concealment under persistent commercial satellite coverage, widespread consumer drone reconnaissance, and volunteer OSINT analysis requires active signature management at a level of discipline and consistency that is very difficult to maintain under operational stress. NATO doctrine has been incorporating those lessons, accelerated by the detailed evidence from Ukraine about what works and what does not. And the next Ukrainian target that follows this pattern, another anomaly observation, another flagged timestamp, another patient analytical cycle building toward a geolocation close, is already in motion. Russia may or may not see it coming. The evidence of this case suggests the answer depends less on Russian sensors than on Russian habits. And habits, under pressure, tend to persist. If this kind of open-source investigative reconstruction is what you want more of, subscribe to Shadow Battlefield. We do this work every week, tracing the evidence chains, following the analytical threads, and documenting the mechanisms through which this war is actually being fought. Beyond the headline advances and the daily loss counts, the detail is where the real story lives. We will keep finding it,